Can the Royals sign Bobby Witt Jr. this year? What are 5 areas to address this offseason? And do we still believe in starting pitcher Daniel Lynch? I'm going to tell you all coming up next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
First things first, thank you for tuning in to another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can find all of our podcasting episodes on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and on Google Podcasts. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. If you are a first-time listener and this is your first ever episode of Locked On Royals, of course, welcome in. And I'm just a diehard Royals fan, as I'm sure you are, tuning into some off-season content. I work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. You know, I do this podcast Monday through Friday. And you know what's crazy? It's been a week. You know, I was off on vacation, kind of MIA, not really posting much on social media, but we're going to be back. Not to worry, we got episodes Monday through Friday, all the way leading up into winter meetings, which will end on December 9th. So once we get to December 9th, that's where we're going to drop back down to 3 episodes a week. But for right now, I was on vacation. Now we're back. No need to worry at this point. 5 episodes a week. They're going to be coming directly to you. We're going to have plenty to talk about as well. We're going to be talking about non-tender candidates. We're going to talk about guys the Royals are picking up, letting go, maybe trading. We're going to have some hypotheticals, some opinions, and of course, every Friday, we like to do those Mailbag Fridays. But today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and we just strongly encourage you, if you want to have a little extra fun, you want to place some more bets, you know, baseball's now over. The baseball season is officially over, but you can still use FanDuel. NFL's in full swing, college football's in full swing, and of course, the NBA and college basketball are just now beginning to tip off, so still plenty of time to go over FanDuel and get some awesome deals when you come here to the Locked On Podcast Network. But to kick off today's show, I wanted to go over, in my eyes, the number one priority this offseason, and it's going to remain consistent all offseason long. You're going to hear me bring up podcast episodes of which pitchers I think are the best, and that's going to change. That is always going to change. There's going to be guys that, you know, their market goes up about 10 to 12 million. There's going to be guys that are signed quicker than I expected. There are going to be non-tender candidates like a Marcus Stroman that I didn't really talk about until now. We're going to have an episode later on this week about Marcus Stroman and if I really think he's a strong fit for the Kansas City Royals. But to me, you know, the number one priority that's always going to remain consistent and really only consistent this year, because I don't believe I'm going to have these same thoughts next year if this deal doesn't get done. That's what an extension may look like for Bobby Witt Jr. Now, every day that passes, I think the Royals are failing at this aspect because you finally have, and you could argue this, the first superstar in the making since George Brett. I think I'm going to go as far to say that. That is nothing against the 2014 and 15 talented cast of players they had. I thought Lorenzo Cain was a star in his own way. Eric Hosmer, a star in his own way. Mike Moustakas, you know, you had Yordano Ventura, Edinson Volquez, Alex Gordon, Billy Butler, Wade Davis, Greg Holland, Alcides Escobar. I can go up and down the list, okay? They were all stars in their own ways. And yes, the Royals fans voted them to all-star games. But I don't think any one of those guys has this ceiling that Bobby Witt Jr. does. And in fact, in Kansas City, there hadn't been anybody since George Brett that everybody knew when the Royals were coming to town, you got to see George Brett. And Bobby Witt Jr. is just scratching that surface. And now I think the Royals need to look at what Arizona did with Corbin Carroll. Now, Bobby Witt Jr. is going to make more than that because what Arizona did was they banked on Corbin Carroll. Now, a lot of moving parts here. Okay, Bobby Witt Jr. is a smart guy. He's a very smart guy that knows, hey, I just had an incredible year, and it really was just a second half surge. I mean, imagine what I could do for a full 162, and I'm still only 23, 24 years old. My market's going to be very high. And I'm sure what he's going to be evaluating, what his family's going to be evaluating is, well, is this team really serious about contending? Because I'll ask you this to the listeners. If you were Bobby Witt Jr. and you had played on two teams that had lost 95 plus games and then 106, I don't think you'd be as sold right now to be locked up for 12 to 13 years. You have to be shown from front office personnel, from other players around you, that you are going to be in the postseason. I mean, these are guys that want to play in the postseason, but everybody wants to play in the postseason. Not everybody, not every front office member, not every owner is serious about getting to the postseason. There are more cutthroat organizations than the Royals. And so for Bobby Witt Jr., it has to be this year. There is no alternative here. If the Royals can't sign Bobby Witt Jr., if they can't lock him up to a 10-plus year deal, and maybe I'm being overzealous here, I'd settle for a 6-year deal that is absolutely front-loaded. I'd settle for a deal like that. But, of course, I'd feel more satisfaction, more comfort knowing, hey, Bobby Witt Jr. is going to be here a long, long, long time. Get your jerseys, get your posters, get your bobbleheads, because he's going to be the guy. And I'm already going to say this next year, the year after this. When the Royals go play somebody, there are going to be opposing fans that say, okay, I want to be in my seat by the time Bobby Witt Jr. gets to the plate. I'm going to be the opposing fan that goes, wow, I saw an incredible play at shortstop by maybe a one-of-one guy who could make that play, being Bobby Witt Jr., even though for some reason he wasn't a Gold Glove finalist. But he's just going to be one of those guys. I remember growing up that, and it sounds crazy now, but Mike Trout to me was always that guy. When the Angels visited Kansas City, it was, I got to go to the game because this is the best baseball player we've ever seen. And I just marveled at what he could do on the baseball field. I marveled at so many things he could do. And Bobby Witt Jr.'s not to Mike Trout status yet. Of course not. I mean, he's got to win an ample amount of awards. He's got to lead the league in numerous categories. He's got to be the best player in baseball to get that Mike Trout status. But there were also other great players that I always was intrigued to go and see, that I knew they were the best player on that team, but maybe they weren't the best player in all of baseball. That to me is what Bobby Witt Jr. is right now. Now, the Royals, I think to a lot of the national perspective here, they're unwatchable. They lost 106 games. There's not, fans of the Mets. There's not fans of the Marlins, already going to the calendar and going, when are we playing the Royals? I don't know why I said two NL East teams. Let's go a team they're going to see next year. There's not Rangers fans going, oh, the Royals come to town here, I'm going to this game. Unless maybe, of course, Bobby Witt Jr. with the Texas connection. You have that. But I'm saying for the majority of MLB fan bases, that's what you have here. You have that type of superstar. When the Royals played the Braves, when they played him earlier this year, I wanted to go to the game because of Ronald Acuna Jr. or because of Matt Olson. Those are stars, Austin Riley. And that's what I think the Royals fully comprehend at this point. But you also have to understand the magnitude here. You can't let a player like that go. Okay, I understand there's going to be people that say, well, you're not going to be contending for 5 to 6 years. That's out the door now. You can contend if you're serious enough, if you spend the money enough. I mean, Arizona, yes, you could say they're a flash in the pan. We may never see Arizona get back to the World Series with this current group, but they got there. They won enough games in the toughest division in baseball. So that to me has, gotten rid of the idea of, well, you need 5 years to rebuild. Don't fall under that assumption. Okay, a deal has to be done, and it has to be done this offseason. As I said, I'm not revisiting this in the offseason of 2024. I'm not going 365 days later and saying, okay, Bobby Witt Jr., what's the deal going to look like? No, it has to happen this year, because if this kid stays healthy, he is going to win multiple awards. He's going to have an all-star selection under his belt. He's going to be one of the best players in all of baseball. You want to have that satisfaction that he is going to be playing for you the next decade. You don't want to have to wonder or fear when that contract year comes up and he wants out of there. He's smart. He knows his value, and I think you better give him that value. You better show him how much he's worth here in Kansas City. And if the Royals can't, somebody else is going to, and you never want it to get to that point. Get it done this offseason. Every day that's passing where you don't sign him to a deal, it's a day wasted. I know these are long negotiations. This maybe would be the biggest contract in franchise history, but damn, he's worth it. He's worth it for the future of baseball in Kansas City. Okay, the next thing we're going to dive into here is 5 areas to address. Andy Rogers of MLB.com did a fantastic article on MLB.com about where the Royals need to address it. I'm going to give you my thoughts next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And before we go any further, let's give a shout out to today's title sponsor in FanDuel. Now, when it gets to Saturday and Sunday, you may already be doing this. You may be sitting down on the couch, placing some bets. Maybe during the week, you're excited for college basketball to get started, or you've already been betting on NBA. Well, just worry about going to FanDuel. That's the first thing you need to do here. After you're done watching this podcast, if you're not already on FanDuel, go to FanDuel and start having the time of your life with sports betting. Now, with FanDuel, right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's pretty easy to do. A $5 money line bet, and you get $150 in bonus bets. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options that includes spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. There's going to be talk all offseason long about the areas this team needs to improve. You lose 106 games, there's going to be a lot of areas you need to improve. And I thought Andy Rogers, beat writer for the Royals and MLB.com, did a great job of kind of ironing out which areas they need to address, and the likelihood is that the Royals go out there and actually address this spot. And, I don't want to waste any time in this second segment because there's 5 segments that we're going to have to go over here. And I don't want to cut it short at 3 segments or 4 segments. So without further ado, here is what Andy Rogers wrote as the 5 areas the Royals need to improve. Now, number 1, can they improve their pitching? Everybody knows that starting pitching is what can make teams that are mediocre a lot better on paper. The Detroit Tigers are a team I constantly bring up, and I think that they are a very easily comparable team to the Royals in their rebuild and how they can get to a point of competitiveness. The Tigers were not a great baseball team last year. But what they did have was a great bullpen. They had an ace in Eduardo Rodriguez. He did opt out of that contract. Offensively, they were putrid. They were a bad offensive unit. The Royals had a better offense than the Tigers last year. But you compare the pitching numbers, it's not even close. Detroit by a landslide. The Royals can absolutely improve their pitching. And there's going to be a lot of guys more available than I thought originally. I mean, again, I said I'm going to have a podcast episode later on in the week about Marcus Stroman. He is somebody that I would love to see the Royals pay a little bit over for. I think he'd be a good fit. They need that workhorse. They need that dog in the rotation. Marcus Stroman is that. But again, we're going to save a full podcast episode for that later on in the week. Can they improve their pitching? Yes, absolutely they can, and for the right prices. They're not going to go into 2024, in my opinion, with Jordan Lyles in this group. Okay, JJ Piccolo said that because what general manager, what president of baseball operations rolls into a press conference and says, yep, Jordan Lyles is no longer with the team. We've already cut him. We're going to cut him. Nobody says that. Okay, he's under contract. You say, well, we like the stuff he did, and he's one of the guys we penciled in. I could be wrong. I sure as hell do not want to be wrong in a situation like this. But I just know the Royals are going to be actively looking for better arms in the rotation to pair with a Cole Reagans and a Brady Singer. So can they improve their pitching? I think absolutely. I think they can, and they have the money to do so. They can do it via trade. They can do it via a 2-3 year deal or a 1 year deal. There are options out there. Do not let anybody convince you otherwise. Number 2 here, how can they help Bobby Witt Jr. in the lineup? Now, here is some of the numbers that Andy Rodgers points out. They scored 676 runs this past year. That was 8th worst in baseball. Their 701 OPS ranked 6th worst, and their WRC plus of 87 was 3rd worst. A lot of that, I think, comes down to not having Vinny Pasquantino in the lineup. There's other factors as well. I mean, not one player is going to change everything, but having a consistent bat in the lineup like that, it would have improved those numbers a lot. I mean, the Royals got no production from first base this year. Absolutely zero. And then you have guys that I think finished the year feeling pretty good about themselves. Bobby Witt Jr., Michael Garcia, MJ Melendez. Even Kyle Isbell had a moment or two. Michael Massey had a stronger second half than he ever did in the first half. But there still is a lot more to be desired. There's a lot left to be desired there. And to me, this is a lineup that can't just piece together a lineup with 1-year deals. You have to go out there and make a serious impact. You are going to need a corner outfield bat. You are going to need to make up your mind on Salvador Perez as well. If Salvy's not in your future, you have to trade him. I think he will lift that or waive the no trade clause. I believe he will, because he said if it's best for the Royals, he would move on from there. But that doesn't mean you just say, well, okay, we're going to roll with Nelson Velasquez at DH and Freddie Freeman can catch. You need more help than that. If this team is going to seriously contend, you have to add a lot of pieces to this lineup. And that may be, you got to find a center fielder who can hit. And Kyle Isbell can't really hit. And maybe that means moving on from MJ Melendez, finding somebody with more consistency. All those things need to be addressed and figured out. But that is going to be one of the top priorities as well, kind of piggybacking off signing Bobby Witt Jr. You got to show you're serious about contending. You got to give him help. And that's one of the ways, or one of the many ways that you can do it. Number 3, who can they trade? You know, this is going to be one area I'm going to be fascinated by in the offseason, because we always talk about big league names, right? We talk about MJ Melendez. You know, I think he'd garner some attention. Edward Olivares, if he's not traded, he'll be non-tendered, I feel like. Drew Waters or Kyle Isbell may be factored in here. Maybe in the end, Brady Singer is going to be a trade candidate. Maybe you try to find a trade candidate for Salvador Perez, but you're not going to seriously improve your team if you're just trying to flip Nick Prado, or you're trying to flip Michael Massey, or you're trying to flip, you know, Justin Edward Olivares or Carlos Hernandez. Where the Royals can get some value is trading some of the guys they have in their farm system that simply just may not be a fit for the big league team. You know, because the Royals are going to have, hopefully, the number 1 overall pick in the draft. At worst, the number 2. I'm not saying the 3 is going to be a bad selection, but for a year like that, you want to be rewarded with the number 1 or number 2 pick. You got to be looking into some minor league guys here. Tyler Gentry, is he really a fit in the outfield for the future? Is Nick Lofton? And I love Nick Lofton. I love the way he plays, but is Nick Lofton a mainstay for the next 3 to 4 years? I mean, those are things you have to factor in here. I mean, you could get a pretty big return on a Frank Mozzicato or a Ben Kudrna. I think those guys could be studs at the big league level, but you don't know. Remember the Andrew Benintendi trade? They traded, Khalil Lee, and everybody was super high on Khalil Lee, including myself. There was a big swing and miss problem. Khalil Lee never did much for the Mets, and the Royals got a pretty good amount out of Andrew Benintendi. Those are the type of moves I think I'd like to see in the offseason to make this team more competitive. Don't just look into trading big league pieces. When you don't have a loaded system, try to find some value around the league by flipping some minor league guys that may be blocked at the big league level. Number 4 on Andy Rodgers' list is, what is Zach Greinke's future? This is one I don't need to think too long on, to be honest with you. Zach Greinke can't be back in a Royals uniform this next year. I know there was kind of a role he settled into. No, he was the stretch pitcher, the long relief guy, the bulk guy, as they called him. But I just don't think you go into 2024 with Zach Greinke as a pitcher in your rotation. It felt like, to me, he was on his way out, asking for the ball in his final road start against Detroit. He finished the year pretty strong. But for the most part of the year, he was not very good. And I think there was a couple of IL stints that you look at it and go, is there any reason to bring him back? I mean, even if he wants to play another year, I don't think I'd go for Zach Greinke. I think you can spend your money a little bit better, even if it was worth $1 or $2 or 1.5. I'd like to spend on other pieces that could get you some return if they pitched really well. I don't think a 40-year-old, a 41-year-old Zach Greinke, if he pitched really well in the first half, could give you value at the trade deadline. And that's more so what I'm looking into. And lastly, where is that stadium announcement? I mean, of course, that is going to be on everybody's mind here in the offseason as well. Where are the Royals going to move? What it's going to look like? What are the numbers on this thing? And right now, there's just not much to comment other than that. I know that I was asked that either in the mailbag or we had a podcast segment dedicated to that. But this is more of a thing where you just don't know. I'd like to give you a definitive and a firm answer, but I can't. I can't because I don't want to lead you in the wrong direction. All I can give you is my opinion. And my opinion is that I don't like talking about the stadium. I like talking about the team. I want the team to be invested in before a move like this. But I understand that when you try to build a new stadium, it's not next year. It's not the year after that. You're talking about a move 5-6 years down the road. And maybe at that point, the Royals are a top contender in the AL. We just simply don't know. And that's kind of why I stay reserved on talking about it. I just simply don't know when that stadium announcement is going to officially come out and we get all the definitive details about it all. But those were some 5 areas to address in the offseason written by Andy Rogers of MLB.com. Before we wrap up the show, we are going to talk about one of the arms in the rotation, or maybe no longer going to be in the rotation. That's Daniel Lynch. Do I still believe in him? I'll tell you next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can catch all these podcasting episodes wherever you get your podcast. That could be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and on Google Podcasts. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe and leave a review. If you want to tell us you love the podcast, you want it to be a little bit better, do not shy away from that. We love hearing the feedback. We always want to make this podcast the best possible heading into the 2024 regular season. But before we wrap up today's show, I want to take a little bit of time and talk about Daniel Lynch and talk about a pitcher that I once held in such high regard. I talked about in a way that I felt he was destined to be the success story of 2018 and that draft class, not the year 2018, of course. But when the Royals drafted him, and I looked at the entire draft class, there was one guy that I looked at and said, he's the one. He's the one that in 2022, we're talking about as the steal of the draft. We're talking about as a future Royals Hall of Famer. He's the guy you want to get your butt to the ballpark, have it in the seat, have your beer, have your soda, have your water, and you're watching Daniel Lynch pitch. As it turns out, and going into 2024, that's likely going to be Cole Reagans, a guy who wasn't even thought of to be a future Royal back in 2018. Nobody even knew that would be possible back then. But for Daniel Lynch, I always thought the stuff would play at the big league level. I thought that his numbers in the minor league level was always going to translate just because of the arsenal, the velocity, the build he had as a pitcher. I mean, being 6'6", not big, but like 195, 200, 210 pounds, kind of a Chris Sale type of build. And if you add in a 3/4 slot or, you can run it up 95, 96, the power slider, work in the change, all of those things made me think, this is a true number one. Because for as many guys they were taking, I still felt like the ceiling had yet to be reached from Daniel Lynch. Brady Singer and Jackson Kowar always to me felt like really safe picks. They're going to be fine. They're going to be good. And Singer had a good year, had an off year, had a really good year, had a really bad year. It's been off and on. Jackson Kowar has never been able to put it together at the big league level. But Daniel Lynch was somebody that I watched him pitch in 2021, or was it 2022? One of those years when he made his debut. And immediately, I just wasn't blown away. I'm like, okay, I'm waiting for this outing where that stuff. And I know he'd had some arm injuries, some elbow injuries, I think a hand injury at one point in the minor league level. But I was always waiting for this high velocity fastball, this power slider. And there were a couple of starts where I said, okay, this is kind of what I'm talking about. There was that start against Oakland where he had double-digit strikeouts for the first time. That was at O.co, but it was Oakland. You talk about the start he had against Detroit. I believe it was 8 shutout innings. You talk about the start against the Dodgers when I think he had 5 or 6 shutout innings. He was starting to hit his groove, but that whole time, none of the stuff felt dominant. It felt like he was just limiting the hard contact. And when you don't have great stuff, that's eventually going to bite you in the butt. That's eventually going to catch up to you. Like Cole Reagans has swing and miss stuff. There are days he's not going to have the best command. He'll still give you 6 1/3 with 3 runs or 4 runs allowed, but he'll have 8, 9, 10 strikeouts. That's swing and miss stuff. Daniel Lynch doesn't have that. I don't think Brady Singer, when he's off, has that stuff. No, Chris Bubich doesn't have that stuff. Jackson Kowar doesn't have that stuff. John Heasley, all those 2018 guys don't have that. And that's why I'm kind of going into 2024. And it was good to see a good outing, a good start in the Arizona Fall League from Daniel Lynch. And I remember back in, I think, the COVID year, right before the COVID year, no, Daniel Lynch went down to the Arizona Fall League and was pumping 98, 99. And I know the gun can be a bit hot when you're down there in Surprise, when you're down there, practicing in Tempe, stuff like that. It can be a bit hot, even in the Fall League. So I didn't want to believe 98 or 99 was truly what he was throwing, but he was probably running it up 95, 96, 97 with consistency. And that was going to be big if Daniel Lynch could do that. But what we saw this year was an injury-prone pitcher, a guy that had very low velocity. You're talking 92, 93, 94. And that's just kind of my answer here. When you throw 92, 93, 94, you can't locate and you don't miss bats. Why should I give a rotational spot to you? Why should I be locking you in as a starter in this group? And I can't. I just can't look at Daniel Lynch and truly believe in the pitcher he can become, because what's the limit? What's the limit for these 2018 pitchers? What year do we walk into the offseason and say, it's it for me? I can't buy into this anymore. To me, it's this year. It's been long enough. When Dayton Moore drafted those college arms, it was not to be sitting here in 2024 going, well, they're going to figure it out. That was supposed to be the case in 2021. I mean, they're college arms. We've seen college guys now in the big leagues get promoted to AAA the year they're drafted. They're supposed to be fast risers, and the ceiling in the big league level is supposed to be lower, but the floor is much higher. None of those guys have really been that form of consistency, which is why I look at this and go, okay, I'm not buying into the consistency. The Royals need consistency. Daniel Lynch could also have a Chris Bubich type of offseason. Now, Chris Bubich didn't make it out of April in 2023. It was a very shortened season for Chris Bubich. But I went into the 2023 offseason going, I don't need to see anything from Chris Bubich. I'm moving on from him. Find somebody else to grab that number 5 spot. And Chris Bubich wasn't going to be starting in the rotation. It wasn't until Daniel Lynch got hurt that he was able to take that spot. But Chris Bubich in the first 2 to 3 weeks of the season was the Royals' best pitcher. It wasn't really close. I mean, if you want to say it was a Aroldis Chapman, that's a bullpen arm. The guy throwing 1 inning a night. Chris Bubich was starting every 5 days and giving you 5 to 6 to even 7 innings. If Daniel Lynch has that type of offseason, then I'll keep him on the roster. It's, of course, I'm saying I'll keep him on the roster. I will root for him to get on the roster is what I'm trying to say. But I just don't know if that's even enough for me at this point. Because these last couple years have been just hoping and praying certain guys turn out to be something. Hoping that Kyle Isbell can have the bat come around. Hoping that MJ Melendez can turn things on. Nick Prado can put it all together. I'm kind of done hoping. I don't want this whole offseason to be about bounce back. I want to see action. I want to see guys that have done it before, have given you 170 innings as a number 5, as a guy who can strike out more than 5 guys per 9, can limit the walks. I want that in a starter, even if it's a number 5. If it's a number 5, I still need consistency. I can't have what Daniel Lynch has been giving me. That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson, and always be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Tomorrow, we are going to talk about Marcus Stroman and if he really is a fit in Kansas City. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.